Borderlands 3 just released one of its biggest hotfixes yet that changes a lot of stuff in the game. We have new weapon changes, some new Vault Hunter changes, and much more. So in this video, I'm going to be covering everything that this new hotfix brings to the game. As always with these types of videos, let's start with a short message from Gearbox themselves. It states, this week's Borderlands 3 hotfixes, which will be live by or before 3 PM PDT today, will target weapons and enemy balance, player characters, and adjusting chances of specific unique drops. Billions of guns were fired, and after collecting some data, we wanted to balance out some weapon types and weapon manufacturers. These adjustments are intended to even the playing field and increase build diversity for all Vault Hunters. Speaking of build diversity, Zane has received a gadget upgrade and we're excited to see players create more unique builds with him. Many crew challenger enemies have specific loot drops, but we receive reports that some were not dropping them. We have made some modifications so that they now have an increased chance of dropping their unique gear, in addition to any of the gear that they may drop. And we will get more into the specifics of those here shortly, but first let's talk about the weapon changes. Starting off with all sniper rifles across the board, we now have an increase to critical hit damage, which has been increased by 20%. We also have a fire rate increase of 15%, the time to aim down sights has been reduced by 15%, and the time to equip has also been reduced by 20% as well. They also briefly mention why they made these changes. It states, sniper rifles deal high damage, but felt a little cumbersome to use in certain scenarios. This change will increase their overall damage and increase usability in more combat engagements. And I think in general, this is a great change across the board. Generally while playing, I did notice compared to previous Borderlands games that most of the snipers felt a little lackluster apart from like one or two of them. And I mainly put that down to the fast pacing of the game and how everything feels a little faster. But either way, I'm happy this change has been made and hopefully the snipers now feel like they're in a great spot. Up next, we have some changes to the pistols. Reading directly from the patch notes here, it states, Jacobs and Torgue pistols were outperforming other manufacturers, dealing damage to groups of enemies at a much higher rate than other pistols. These new changes we're implementing keep their identity intact, but reduces the overall group control. TDO, Dahl, and Children of the Vault pistols have manufacturer penalties that affected their overall damage, but increasing their overall damage will overcome some of the penalties while retaining their unique and gameplay feel. And in terms of the changes to these weapons, we have increased damage on all TDO and Dahl pistols by 15%. The Children of the Vault pistols have had a damage increase of 20%. They have also reduced the damage of Jacobs pistols by 15% across the board, and they have also reduced the damage of Torgue pistols by 10%. So a lot of big changes to the pistols here. Anyway, moving on to the Maliwan weaponry now, it states Maliwan weapons had reduced overall damage because they applied damage over time effects at a rate and damage greatly above other manufacturers. This effect was toned down before launch, but the overall damage was not sufficiently adjusted to compensate for the reduction in elemental damage over time. We're adding back some of the overall damage and making the weapons faster so elemental builds can really take advantage of Maliwan weaponry. In terms of these new buffs, we have an increase to all Maliwan weapon damage by 25%, and an increase to Maliwan fire rate by 20%. Again, these changes are really big, and it's going to be interesting to find out which Maliwan weapons will now stand out amongst the rest. Another weapon manufacturer getting a buff is Atlas. All Atlas weapon damage has now been increased by 25%. They stated on their patch notes that Atlas weapons relied on a game loop that we felt gave players a greater advantage when used correctly. Turns out the loop is not used if damage doesn't compensate for the time to set up. So now damage on Atlas weapons should facilitate players by using them in general on top of feeling badass when they take advantage of Atlas technology. So just an overall and much needed boost to Atlas weapons there. And then for the final segment of the weapon changes, we have some miscellaneous adjustments. To begin, all Jacobs assault rifles have had a damage increase of 20%. All Dahl SMGs have had a damage increase of 10%, Vladov heavy weaponry has had a damage increase of 25%, and E-Tech TDO shotguns have had a damage increase of 50%. Alongside this, we also have some legendary weapon modifications. Reading directly from their patch notes again here, it states, we're going to be making a larger comprehensive legendary gear pass, but we have included the following changes. The King's and Queen's Call were modified to lower the fire rate. The weapon has a limited burst shot count, so the overall feel of the gun isn't dramatically affected. So again, the King's and Queen's Call here have had a slight nerf in the reduction of fire rate there, which is quite a lot, being 50%, but even with that, the weapon is still very, very good. Coming up next, we have a few miscellaneous changes. Starting off, legendary loot drops have been balanced throughout the game. Crew challenge enemies will drop their intended specific loot, and some enemies like Troy and the Rampager will be a bit more stingy and no longer drop legendaries every kill. This is quite the game changer, and a lot of the old spots where people used to farm for legendaries may not be quite as rewarding this time around. In addition to this, we also have some changes to the boss fight known as Grave Ward. This is a location that of course a lot of people use to farm for legendaries, but anyway, he has now been buffed, so he will be harder to kill. To quote, Grave Ward's beam attacks did not properly scale based on level, so at higher levels the two beam attacks hardly phase players. This time around, players will find his attacks to be more lethal, and in addition to this, Grave Ward is a very large enemy, and is too easily susceptible to elemental damage, unlike the other large bosses. Elemental damage on Grave Ward is now greatly reduced, but to compensate, Grave Ward's overall health has been reduced. In terms of the percentages here, attacks on Grave Ward will essentially now scale based on your level. His overall health has now been reduced by 20%, his elemental chance resistance has been increased by 70%, his elemental resistances overall have been increased by 30%, and his elemental damage over time duration has been reduced by 30%. So some big buffs there to Grave Ward. In other news, the vending machines in Borderlands 3 will now be restocked with higher quality items of the day. This was very much a needed change in my opinion, as I never once saw an item of the day that I actually purchased throughout my whole time playing. In addition to this, and another big change here, the Hollow Point Guardian rank skill has been temporarily disabled, as there was a huge bug with this skill in general, in which they are going to rework this and add it back into the game at a later date. And the final change in this section is that Vault Hunters should no longer scream their heads off when affected by damage over time while your shields are active. And for the final section of the video, we have some big changes to some of the Vault Hunters. Starting off with Zane here, and to quote directly from the patch notes, it states, Zane's gadgets were great at providing additional utility, but lacked impact as players leveled up. We increased the digiclone damage with all equipped weapons so that the skill can scale better with players as they get to higher levels and harder content. The drone requires a lot of player involvement to take full advantage of its damage output, and increasing the base damage as well as the augments will greatly increase the drone's versatility and reward players even more for using it effectively. The digiclone damage has now been increased by 38%, the drone's rocket damage and overall damage as well has been increased by 50%, and the almighty ordnance rockets damage has also been increased by 75%. This is great news for you Zane players out there. A lot of people felt that Zane wasn't as strong in the late game as some of the other Vault Hunters, so with these changes it's going to be really interesting to see how this affects his gameplay and gameplay style. In addition to this, we also have a few changes to Amara. Her Guardian Angel health restoration has now been reduced from 100% down to 50%, and her glamour damage penalty has now been reduced from -30% to -10%. I actually don't have an Amara character just yet to be able to even test these changes, so be sure to let me know what you think of these in the comment section below. And for the final Vault Hunter, going through some pretty big changes, we have Flak. The Gorillas in Mist augment skill, which allowed Flak's fadeaway to not end when you attacked an enemy, is getting a pretty big debuff. The duration of this skill is being reduced from 8 seconds down to 6 seconds, and the critical hit damage bonus is getting a huge reduction from 50% down to 25%. In a statement from Gearbox, it mentions, Gorillas in the Mist bonuses greatly outweighed its penalty to the base skill. We don't want to remove the playstyle completely, but the overall damage output had to be slightly adjusted because it was outperforming other builds. We're monitoring the changes and may make another change to the ammo return in a future patch. And when they say slightly adjusted, it's quite a big adjustment in my opinion anyway. And you know, coming from someone who mains Flak, this does sting quite a bit, but I can understand why they have also done it. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on all of these changes in the comment section below. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video today, and be sure to check out this video on screen right now if you want to see some cool locations where you can get legendary weapons from. Peace.